So Jenna, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mary Liz. Well, as Mary Liz has mentioned, food safety really, starts in the garden. And so when harvesting, you don't want to use any produce that has been visibly contaminated by animals, such as evidence of any animal feces, of course. That's an obvious source of harmful pathogens. Or any evidence of any insect damage. We know that insects can vector diseases as well. Now you can brush as much of the dirt off of the produce as possible using a clean scrub brush, but it's generally best to not wash the produce under water until you're really just about ready to use it. Of course, the con to this is that the unwashed produce could contain pathogenic microorganisms in which you are now bringing into your kitchen. But on the other hand, if you wash it before storing, it may mold or it can rot kind of more quickly. So, if the produce is really kind of heavily soiled and you choose to wash it before you store it, you should really make sure that you are thoroughly drying the produce with a clean paper towel. That can work to prevent it, from spoiling. So how you handle produce during harvest really is going to directly affect the produce quality. Almost all of the vegetables are best whenever they're harvested early in the morning. And that's because during those overnight hours, the vegetables will regain moisture that they lost during the day. And that rate of water loss, it will vary, of course, upon the type of the produce. Certainly your leafy green vegetables like spinach, for example, they're going to lose water pretty quickly because they have thin skin with many pores, and other types of vegetables like potatoes, they're going to have a little thick, kind of more corky skin with very few pores. And so they're going to lose a bit less water. But in general, it's always best to kind of harvest during those morning hours and try to keep the produce cool under shade and transfer kind of the appropriate produce then to the cold storage really promptly to minimize the water loss and to slow down too the carbohydrate and vitamin loss that also happens over time. Your fruits and vegetables, they will certainly suffer if you are rough handling them. So it's not just your bruised peaches, but produce like potatoes, they're going to bruise as well. So you don't want to dump your produce from one bin to another or throw the produce into bins or boxes. That rough handling can really cause bruising, which of course leads to potentially wasted food. At the same time, you don't want to overfill these containers where they, might fall out and also may bruise as well. So many fruits and vegetables and herbs should only be stored at room temperature because refrigeration can cause cold damage or prevent them from ripening to that good flavor and that good texture that you want. So here on the screen, you'll see kind of a list of those foods that you really do not want to refrigerate. So we're talking about basil. That's one of those really testy herbs that does not like really cold temperatures. It also doesn't like really, really hot temperatures either. But also tomatoes and garlic and ginger and onions and potatoes and your pumpkins and winter squash. You can see melons and persimmons on there, peaches, pears, plums, all of those as well until they are nice and ripe. And so keeping these, on the counter or keeping these basically, away from direct sunlight is what you're going to want to do. And remember as well about kind of how you're storing these, or if you're going to store things together. So, potatoes and onions, for example, they should be stored separately in a cool, dark place because those potatoes are going to be sensitive to the onions, the ethylene gas that it's going to be releasing. And so that can cause those potatoes to really ripen and kind of go bad before you're really ready to use them. Refrigerate then some of these others. So herbs other than basil, leafy greens as well, beets, radishes, carrots, green onions, all of these things here that you can see on the slide, as well as anything that has already been cut. So your cut fruits, cut vegetables, once you slice into them, they are now potentially hazardous and they need to be kept cool. A good way to store your herbs, as well as asparagus too, is to place them upright in a jar or a glass with about 2 to 3 inches of water. And then you can, if you do it that way, they'll last, quite a few days. You could also wrap like those herbs and wrap them into like a damp paper towel, place them in an open plastic baggie or container and put them into the refrigerator. That's another way to really store those items. Of course, with our refrigerators, we need to make sure that they are at refrigeration temperatures, and that means 41 degrees Fahrenheit or less at all times. We know that bacteria is likely to grow at temperatures above this. However, you do have to keep in mind too, some bacteria like Listeria, it will actually grow at refrigeration temperatures. Things in our refrigerators, as I'm sure you may have noticed, can still mold. So, do make sure, of course, that you're not keeping foods lingering in the refrigerator for too long. And, of course, you want to be sure that your fridge maintains the proper temperature. And so that means placing a thermometer in the warmest part of the fridge. And that's generally the bottom shelf of the door. And that can help to make sure that all parts of your fridge is holding that produce and holding those foods under that 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, we got to keep our refrigerators nice and clean and organized. So the harvest boxes that Mary Liz talked about, of course, those, as she said, do need to be food grade, food safe. And we do say that, yeah, it's probably not best though to just take and use those harvest boxes and then put them directly into the refrigerator for storage. And that's just especially because, if you haven't maybe washed those or brushed those off with any dirt, you're placing them now in these harvest containers. And now those containers can also be contaminated. And so it's just best to put them in a kind of a different or new food grade container that's been washed as well. And remember to as Mary Liz said, only use those food grade containers where we can, not those garbage sacks, old kind of paint buckets or things like that never held food in the first place. Keeping organized means considering labeling the produce container to indicate whether or not it has already been washed and dried, and the date that you actually harvested it. So you may want to try to use the produce, as soon after the harvest as possible. That's certainly going to help to minimize any nutrient losses and to help prevent decay as well. If unwashed produce touched washed produce or any other food items, those items have just become contaminated. So store unwashed produce on the lower shelves away from other foods. And of course, always avoid cross-contamination with any raw meat. So if you've got, raw meat in there that you're working with just with your own family, just really be sure, of course, to keep that very much separate from all of your other foods, particularly your unwashed produce or any kind of produce at all. So, we mentioned not storing, onions and potatoes together because, those potatoes are sensitive to ethylene and they could start to sprout when you're not ready for that. So ethylene gas is a natural gas that's produced by plants to start the ripening process. And some plants will produce more than others, just as some plants are more sensitive to it than others. So you don't want to store high ethylene producing fruits next to your ethylene sensitive plants. And so with this next slide here, we've shown you just kind of a little bit of a list of these high or kind of medium ethylene producing fruits. Most of our ethylene producers are in fact fruits. So it's just a kind of a good rule of thumb to store your fruits and your vegetables in separate places. And so for those that are stored in your refrigerator, storing them in separate crisper drawers would be the good idea. And then, of course, we've got here just a list of some of those ethylene sensitive produce. Apples, these are one of the highest producers of ethylene. but they also are ethylene sensitive as well. And so, prolonged exposure to ethylene can really cause these apples to taste very mealy and not very crisp. So they're not going to be real great if they have been exposed to ethylene gas for too long. So as we mentioned, it's really best to wash that produce right before you're ready to use it. We do, of course, want to make sure, as Mary Liz mentioned, a really important thing is to always make sure we're washing our hands, and that includes right before we are ready to wash our produce. Also, rinse that produce before you peel it. So all the melons and all of those things that, you just want to stick a knife into it and start slicing it. Well, you can't do that unless you wash it first. And that's so that the dirt and bacteria aren't transferred from the knife onto the fruit or the vegetable flesh. So make sure to wash it before you start slicing into it. You'll want to gently rub that produce while you're holding it under that running water. There's really no need to use any soap. Don't use any kind of produce wash. Just water will do the job. You can use a clean vegetable brush to scrub some of those firmer produce like your melons and different squashes. Dry the produce with a clean cloth or paper towel, and that can help to further reduce any bacteria that can be present. So here we've got Mary Liz Wright has a little video that she's going to show you on how to wash leafy greens. So this is kind of a question that sometimes we get on what's the proper way to wash this. And so I think Mary Liz here has some very dirty leafy greens here. So we're going to get this video started.
We're going to wash some leafy greens. If you have a garden or you go to the farmer's market, lettuces and other leafy greens are going to have some soil on them. So we want to get all the dirt off, and we do that by filling a basin or a tub full of cool water. You really don't want to do this in your sink because your sink could have some bacteria in it, and you certainly don't want that on your lettuce. So we're going to dump our greens in the basin and swish them around quite a bit. You might want to trim some of the ends off as you go, pulling out any discolored leaves that have some insect damage on them. You want to get those out of there as well. Move them in that water to loosen any particles of dirt that are in between the leaves. Pull them out. You're going to do this until your water is clear. And you can see my water is very dark. So we're going to dump this, add more water, and do it again. You don't need any commercially prepared wash. You don't need to use any chemicals. Plain water will clean your fruits and vegetables to a safe level. When you pour the water out of your basin after your final rinse, you shouldn't feel any grit. We're going to spin all the moisture off of our lettuce. You shouldn't wash your fruits or vegetables until you're ready to eat them. Moisture will cause them to spoil more quickly. And there we have fresh greens ready to eat. If you would like to wash your lettuce a few hours ahead and store it, put it loosely in a plastic bag, put a paper towel in so it can absorb some of the moisture, and then place this in the vegetable crisper drawer of your refrigerator.
Okay, so that was a great video, and I think that Mary Liz, she's got a lot of these Cooking with Mary Liz videos. If you are ever interested, make sure to go over to YouTube, type in Cooking with Mary Liz, and you'll see some of her videos. And so there she showed you a little bit about washing leafy greens, and she's got some other videos on there about how to wash some other produce, as well as some food preservation videos as well. So it's always important to monitor temperatures and keep any potentially hazardous foods such as your meats and dairy and cooked grains and cut fruits and vegetables. All of these foods need to stay out of the danger zone. And the danger zone is those temperatures between 41 degrees Fahrenheit and 135 degrees Fahrenheit. So foods that are left in these temperatures for too long can lead to foodborne illness. So we want to, yes, refrigerate, cut produce promptly, make sure it doesn't stay in that danger zone, and never thaw food on the counter at room temperature. I know that sometimes I have to get after my mom, and I hate to just shout that out here now. She's not here to defend herself, but she used to always just kind of would thaw at room temperature. But remember, that's not going to be the safe way. We have here potentially hazardous food in that danger zone where bacteria can start to grow and to multiply. So the only ways to safely thaw potentially hazardous food is in the refrigerator, under cold running water, or in the microwave. And if you're going to thaw in the microwave, you do need to make sure that you're going to cook it immediately after you've thawed it in the mic. So we always do need to make sure that we're cooking foods to the proper temperature. And we do that by using a calibrated food thermometer. You can insert that into kind of the thickest and the most center part of the food to make sure that you have cooked it to that proper temp. When you're ready to cool hot foods down, do so promptly. And this can be done by filling a sink with ice and cold water and placing that container of the food into the ice water. Stirring it will also help to cool it down faster. If it's something like soup and it's not going to affect the quality, throw some ice cubes in there. Get it to cool down quicker. That is the goal. And then transfer those large pots of food to shallow pans. That's less than 3 inches in depth.